Hello, welcome to the Self Learning Podcast by Dr. Sushma Singh. Let us start Chapter 5, Indian Sociologist. As you saw in the opening chapter of your first book, Introducing Sociology, the discipline is a relatively young one, even in the European context, having been established only about a century ago. In India, interest in sociological ways of thinking is a little more than a century old, but formal university teaching of sociology only began in 1919 at the University of Bombay. In 1920, two other universities, though at Calcutta and Lucknow, also began programs of teaching and research in sociology and anthropology. Today, every major university has a department of sociology, social anthropology, or anthropology, and often more than one of these disciplines is represented. Nowadays, sociology tends to be taken for granted in India, like most established things. But this was not always so. In the early days, it was not clear at all what an Indian sociology would look like, and indeed whether India really needed something like sociology. In the first quarter of the 20th century, those who became interested in the discipline had to decide for themselves what role it could play in India. In this chapter, you are going to be introduced to some of the founding figures of Indian sociology. These scholars have helped to shape the discipline and adapt it to our historical and social context. The specificity of the Indian context raised many questions. First of all, if Western sociology emerged as an attempt to make sense of modernity, what would its role be in a country like India? India, too, was of course experiencing the changes brought about by modernity, but with an important difference. It was a colony. The first experience in modernity in India was closely intertwined with the experience of colonial subjugation. Secondly, if social anthropology in the West arose out of the curiosity felt by the European society about primitive cultures, what role could it be in India? What was an ancient and advanced civilization, but which also had primitive societies within it? Finally, what useful role could sociology have in a sovereign, independent India, a nation about to begin its adventure with planned development and democracy? The pioneers of Indian sociology not only had to find their own answers to questions like these, they also had to formulate new questions for themselves. It was only through the experience of doing sociology in an Indian context that the questions took shape. They were not able, ready made, as is often the case. In the beginning, Indians became sociologists and anthropologists mostly by accident. For example, one of the earliest and best known pioneers of social anthropology in India, L.K. Anantakrishna Iyer, 1861 to 1937, began his career as a clerk, moved on to become a school teacher, and later a college teacher in Cochin state in present-day Kerala. In 1902, he was asked by the Diwan of Cochin to assist with an ethnographic survey of the state. The British government wanted similar surveys done in all the princely states as well as the presidency areas directly under its control. Ananta Krishna Iyer did this work on a purely voluntary basis, working as a college teacher in the Maharaja's College at Ernakulam during the week and functioning as the unpaid superintendent of ethnography in the weekends. His work was much appreciated by British anthropologists and administrators of the time, and later he was also invited to help with a similar ethnographic survey in Mysore state. Ananta Krishna Iyer was probably the first self-taught anthropologist to receive national and international recognition as a scholar and an academician. He was invited to lecture at the University of Madras and was appointed as reader at the University of Calcutta, where he helped set up the first postgraduate anthropology department in India. He remained at the University of Calcutta from 1917 to 1932, though he had no formal qualifications in anthropology. He was elected president of the ethnology section of the Indian Science Congress. He was awarded an honorary doctorate by a German university during his lecture tour of European universities. He was also conferred the title of Rao Bahadur and Diwan Bahadur by Cochin state. The lawyer Sarat Chandra Roy 1871 to 1942 was another accidental anthropologist and pioneer of the discipline in India. Before taking his law degree in Calcutta's Ripon College, Roy had done graduate and postgraduate degrees in English. Soon after he had begun practicing law, he decided to go to Ranchi in 1898 to take up a job as an English teacher at the Christian missionary school. This decision was to change his life, for he remained in Ranchi for the next 44 years and became the leading authority on the culture and society of the tribal peoples of the Chota Nagpur region, present-day Jharkhand. Roy's interest in anthropological matters began when he gave up his school job and began practicing law at the Ranchi courts, eventually being appointed as the official interpreter in the court. Roy became deeply interested in tribal society as a byproduct of his professional need to interpret tribal customs and laws to the court. He traveled extensively among tribal communities and did intensive field work among them. All of this was done on an amateur basis, but Roy's diligence and keen eye for detail resulted in valuable monographs and research articles. During his entire career, Roy established more than 100 articles in leading Indian and British academic journals. In addition to his famous monographs on the Orient, the Mundas, and the Khalsis, Roy soon became very well known amongst anthropologists in India and Britain and was recognized as an authority on Chota Nagpur. He founded the journal Man in India in 1922, the earliest journals of its kind in India that is still published. Both Ananta Krishna Iyer and Sarat Chandra Roy were true pioneers. In the early 1900s, they began practicing a discipline that did not yet exist in India and which had no institutions to promote it. But both Iyer and Roy were born, lived, and died in an India that was ruled by British. The four Indian sociologists you are going to be introduced in this chapter were born on generation later than Iyer and Roy. They became of age in colonial era, but their careers continued into the era of independence, and they helped to shape the first formal institutions that established Indian sociology. G.S. Ghurye and D.P. Mukherjee were born in the 1890s, while A.R. Desai and M.N. Srinivas were about 15 years younger, having been born in the second decade of the 20th century. Although they were all deeply influenced by Western traditions of sociology, they were also able to offer some initial answers to the questions that the pioneers could only begin to ask. What shape should a specifically Indian sociology take? Now let us wind up the session, and thank you very much for engaging yourself with the Self Learning podcast.